Beautiful town. I hope that whenever better times arrive, we can lure you up from your garret in Brooklyn to come see our jewel of a library in Stockbridge. You'll like it a lot. Just to introduce you a little further, you've written 10 books of poetry now. You just published a book in April called a new collection called Stranger by Night, and 5 prose books. You've won a lot of awards, including the National Book Critics Circle Award and a MacArthur Genius Award. I'd like to talk some with you about your own work, but first I'd like to talk about poetry in a more general way. And there are a couple of sentences you wrote a while ago that really struck me as a definition of poetry. I'd like to read them to you and then talk about it a little bit. You wrote, "We read poems for all sorts of reasons, to be challenged, disturbed, consoled, recognized. We look to poetry for articulation, for knowledge." Can you talk a little bit about that, why we read poetry, why we should read poetry?
Thanks, Andre. It's nice to see you. I think that poetry is weirdly suited to the moment because of the nature of its communication. And the way I think of poetry is a communication between two people who are not physically present to each other. I'm thinking I'm not thinking of readings right now. I'm thinking of when you read a poem. And the intimacy and intensity of the experience makes you feel as if you're somehow connected and speaking directly to some other person that you don't actually know, more intimately than you actually can talk to them socially. I personally think of poetry as a meeting of solitudes in which one isolate meets another isolate over a text or over some words. And the poem says things that will be hard to say socially. It's more intimate, more intense, more meaningful in some ways. So I think that poetry speaks to our inner lives, to our interiority, as well as our social selves. So the paradox of poetry is it's so personal and so private, but language is social, and by its very nature is social. So a poem, no matter how solitary it seems, always implies a listener. It always implies a reader. It always implies a kind of contact to some future person. And for me, that, I'll call it a participation mystique, is crucial to poetry and to a kind of lyric exchange.
Didn't Yeats call poetry a kind of quarrel with oneself?
Yes, he said rhetoric is a quarrel with other people, poetry is a quarrel with oneself. And I've always liked that. Thanks for bringing it up. I've always liked that idea because it means that as the reader, you're sometimes overhearing an argument that someone is having with himself or herself. A lot of political poetry is spoken from a platform. And I've never found that we need political poetry, but the platform has never been convincing to me. I don't like poetry that has a kind of design or intention that's very aggressive on the reader and that has that kind of purpose. But I do like the feeling that the poet is arguing with oneself, trying to figure something out, trying to think through something that's important to him or her, and the reader gets to listen in and hear that and hear one's own thoughts. There's a feeling sometimes when you read a poem. Sometimes you read a poem and you like it or don't like it. Sometimes you read a poem and wish you'd written it. Sometimes you read a poem that you feel so responsive to, you feel almost as if you've written the thing to which you're only responding, as if your own inner thoughts have somehow been articulated. Those are the poems that have helped me the most in my life because they make you feel that something that was inchoate in you has now become articulated.
But that brings up an interesting sort of dilemma. Does the poet write for himself, or are you writing for a reader?
I don't think you're writing entirely for yourself, because if you are, you're writing a diary. And a diary entry is fine, but it's not meant to be read. It's meant supposedly to yourself as an audience. I think that a poem is written first for yourself, but then for others. Gertrude Stein said, I write for myself and strangers. That makes sense to me. W.H. Auden adds, I write for myself and strangers and the great dead, meaning you're trying to live up to something of poets who've come before you. So a poet who writes entirely for himself or herself is not that interesting to me because it's a private communication. But a poet who crafts something, the oldest word for poetry in Greek is poesis, which means making, which suggests that a poem is a made thing and a poet is a maker and a poem is a made thing. So you are quarreling with yourself, you're trying to figure something out, you're also trying to articulate it in language for someone else. Now that it can be your contemporaries or it can be some future reader, but it does always, the idea of making a poem does imply a potential reader of a poem.
Uh-huh. So when you write a poem, are you conscious of a reader looking over your shoulder, or are you just focused on the moment of writing?
It's extremely puzzling to try and figure this out as you go, but my own feeling is that you're reading it back to yourself and you're writing it, you're articulating it, but you're also listening to it. And also, I'm highly aware that you're trying to read it while you're trying to express something. You're also trying to read it as if you don't know yourself at all. And what I mean by that is that I don't assume that my reader knows anything about me. I think of my reader as a stranger. And what I mean by that is that anything that seems important for someone to know in the poem, I have to put in the poem itself. And so there's a kind of, Larkin called it theatricality in poetry. He said poetry is emotional in nature and theatrical in performance. And I think that suggests that anything that's crucial to you, you need to put into the poem for someone who doesn't know anything about you.
Uh-huh.
There are some poets I think who feel completely comfortable with letting their readers think anything they want and don't have a particular meaning in mind. But I think of a poem as a dramatic action. And I like Robert Frost's dictum, everything written is as good as it is dramatic. And so if it's important to you, then it seems to me you want to dramatize it for someone else who doesn't know you. So that's the act of making a poem.
Uh-huh. Do you think there's such a thing as impersonal poetry then, or is everything, depending on the temperature of the poem, is everything highly emotional?
I think there's always an element of impersonality because you're writing as if someone doesn't know you. I don't like if you're referring to T.S. Eliot's theory of impersonality in poetry, I don't think that's, I think that was a disguise by Eliot. Robert Bly said that Eliot's idea of the objective correlative was astoundingly passionless, which always made me laugh. I think it's astoundingly passionless. I think that Eliot was an extremely personal poet who disguised that fact around an idea of impersonality. What I mean by that is that Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock is a completely personal poem by T.S. Eliot, but he completely distracts us by calling it a dramatic monologue and giving us the name of Prufrock. At one point, he said that the wasteland is a personal grouse against existence. I mean, Eliot hides behind the idea of impersonality to express something that was really personal. At the same time, I don't think a poem is merely personal. I just don't think it will work. It has to be somehow objectified in language. Something that you feel has to find an expression or articulation in language, and that's not just personal, that's impersonal. I personally believe there's something, poets like to congratulate themselves about their great emotional intensity, but I think there's something a little cold about being a poet. And what I mean by that is that you're willing to cannibalize your own experience, to look at your own life and write about it for strangers. And there's something a little dispassionate about that and even cruel, because you're not just exposing yourself, you're also exposing other people to write about. You're not writing from their point of view, but you're writing about your own life. And if you write about your own life and expose that to others, there are going to be other people that are implicated. And so there's something that is a little, that you have to be willing to be courageous and look hard at experience and expose yourself and
Well,
then transform it.
everything you're saying echoes Robert Graves' comment that to be a poet is a condition, not a profession. And you can't help being a poet, right? If you are by nature a poet, you can't be something else.
I think poetry is a vocation, and it's a calling. It's not a career. The only thing I would say about that I don't exactly like about Graves's notion, I love Robert Graves, by the way, and I love his definition of poetry, which is steward magic. To the idea that a poem can go around for centuries and then you open it up and the magic is released inside of you. And I'm always very stimulated when I read him. But I'm an American and I have a democratic sensibility filtered through Whitman. And I don't think you're just born to be a poet. I think you can learn how to be something. And you can learn about poetry. There is an element of craft in poetry that's like someone making a table. Or making other things. I mean, it's not only a craft, but there's a craft-like element. And so you can get to be a better poet and you can learn how to be a better poet by studying poetry. So it's not just a God-given right, because if that were the case, given the history of poetry, we know poetry would then only be for white males. But it's not true. A democratic ethos has opened poetry to other people. And by doing that, you release something in them. So I'm all for throwing open the doors. But within that, I think when you teach people and you bring people to poetry, what you're trying to model is that this isn't a career. You don't do it for gain. You do it for the disinterested love of the art and trying to make something and participate in something.
You don't write poetry for the gain?
For the game?
The gain.
Oh, the gain. Well,
I think so.
I guess I've gotten rich writing poetry. What a blockhead to go into poetry for money.
Yeah, really.
What a fool.
I'm interested by what you're saying because it goes against the commonly held theory that poets are born, not made. And there's a kind of wellspring in you and it just leaps out of you. That you're saying you can be taught, and of course you can be, but I'm interested that, how would you approach this? Do you think somebody has to have the inner kernel before they can actually become a poet, or can they just be taught to be a poet?
You can't, not everything in poetry can be willed. I mean, I love Shelley's defense of poetry. And in it, he says, not even the greatest poet can say, I will compose poetry, because poetry is never entirely at the dispensation of the will. So there are certain things you cannot teach, you cannot will, that cannot be learned, and cannot be determined by the intellect. That being said, everyone has a certain, I would say, ceiling of what they could do. This is how I think about teaching poetry and teaching in general. Everyone has a certain ceiling of what they're capable of doing. I might want to write Paradise Lost, but much as I would like to write that, it's not given to me to be able to do. I can't will myself to write Paradise Lost or Keats's Last Odes, which I happen to love, especially To Autumn. You can't will that to yourself, but you can get to be better at something. And my own experience with people is that very few people, if you have a ceiling, very few people come near the ceiling of their talent or their promise just by not working hard enough. So if your ceiling is very low, but you go all the way to the top of your ceiling, you will accomplish much more than someone whose ceiling is very high, but never works at it, never studies, never does anything, and stays very low. So when you're a teacher, one of the things you can't gauge is determination, will, eagerness, and how hard someone will work. And I've just seen over the years many students that I thought were fabulously talented who did very little, and students who seemed to me less talented, but who did quite a lot because they were willing to put themselves to school on poetry and to work at their craft and to learn things about it. So I find that encouraging, and I'm aware of my own limits. And I think every poet becomes aware of his or her own limits. But you have to do the best you can. And most people don't. Most people just are too lazy. They're not serious enough about throwing themselves at this thing.
Well, as you measure yourself in your own work and you measure yourself against other poets, there are surely some poets you particularly admire. Maybe some of them you've known quite well. I wonder if you could tell us about one or two poets who've meant a great deal to you emotionally.
You know, when you start out writing, I didn't know any poets. I didn't. It seems it still seems to me kind of crazy, the idea of becoming a poet, and especially my becoming a poet, because I didn't really know any poets. I just had some idea. Oh, this would be, you could do this. This would be, there must have been some poets, but I didn't know any living ones. And I went to college, I didn't know any poets. And for most of my time at college, I didn't know any poets. And I just had a vague idea that this would be a life you could make for yourself. And there had to be some out there. So when I got to be in my later 20s, and then I published a book when I was 31, I started to meet poets. And that was wildly exciting to me because I'd never really known any. And it was really fun. And I liked to talk to them about poetry. And it really shaped me. Now, I thought I was pretty old at the time because I was 31. I didn't think of myself as that young. And I started meeting some poets who were in their 50s, who seemed to me like really advanced. I mean, their careers were like far away. And they seemed to me the poets we were reading. I mean, like Adrian Rich or W.S. Merwin or Philip Levine, who was especially important to me. And so I started meeting these poets and talking to them about poetry. And I started meeting poets my own age too. And that was just really exciting to have people to talk to about poetry.
Phil, you shared a Midwestern background with Phil Levine, and you got to know him pretty well, I think.
Yeah, Phil took an interest in me because when I published my first book, my publisher sent it to him, and I had just taken a job at Wayne State University in Detroit, and that was his school. And so he was interested that there was a poet teaching in Detroit. And so he responded well to my first book, and then he had a twin brother who still lived in Detroit, and he came to Detroit and invited me over for brunch. And I went and I got to meet him, and we just, our backgrounds were so similar. And he said things that surprised me. He was more shockingly truthful than I am. And he could really make me laugh. And we really hit it off. I mean, I'll never forget the very first time I met him. And he went to the John, and his twin brother, who looked exactly like him, was there. And I was talking about some poet I knew in Detroit, and said, he's the angriest person I've ever met. And Eddie Levine said, well, yeah, you didn't really know my brother in his heyday. Phil was less crazy with rage when he was young. He'd mellowed a little by the time I met him, but he really could make me laugh. He's really just shockingly truthful. Like, he wouldn't volunteer mean things. Like, he wouldn't go out of his way to say anything negative to you. But if you asked him, he just was incapable of lying. And so he would tell you. And a lot of people couldn't stand it. And so they asked him, and they really got a blast.
What would be an example of his utter truthfulness?
He was teaching at the University of Cincinnati. And there was a poet who wanted him to write a letter of recommendation for a Guggenheim Fellowship. And Phil said, I don't like your work. And the guy said, does that mean you won't write a letter of recommendation for me? And Phil said, you don't understand what I'm saying. I'm saying I don't actually like your poetry. I wouldn't want to say that to someone. I wouldn't actually like your poetry. The guy said, well, you're the most famous person I know. Would you still write a letter for me? So Phil's letter, which he showed me later, was not even the Guggenheim Foundation, with all of its resources, could turn this man into a poet.
Oh,
whoa.
brutal.
Brutal. But on the other hand, he did warn him.
Yeah.
It's not like he just
total honesty.
Just total honesty. So yeah,
Well,
he could be bracing.
That's a great example of an American poet. You're also quite well known for advocating Eastern European poetry. I think you might have been the first American critic to really push forward Wisława Szymborska, who then won the Nobel Prize in poetry, and no American audience had ever heard of her. She had a reputation in Europe. You had a relationship with Miłosz, with Joseph Brodsky. You want to talk about them a little bit and what especially Polish poetry has meant to you?
Yeah. When I was in my early 20s, I was, if you don't mind, I'm just going to go back a little on this to explain how this happened. My teachers were all modernists, and I was a modernist too. But I was very troubled by something in Eliot and Pound, and that was their coldness. I mean, I was put onto this, of course, because they were anti-Semitic, and their anti-Semitism bothered me incredibly, even though everyone just sort of passed over it in those days and said it wasn't important. It was important to me, and it was appalling. And I was troubled by their misogyny, and I was troubled by their idea that poetry should be cold, but everything else they considered sentimental. But they are tremendously intellectual, and especially Eliot is a really great poet. So their work had a lot of authority. But I was looking for some kind of alternative that I didn't know I was looking for. And then I found out about Polish poetry. And then I discovered Russian poetry, which Brodsky belongs in the high tradition of these Russian poets that I fell in love with, which was Anna Akhmatova and Osip Mandelstam and early Boris Pasternak and Marina Tsvetaeva. But none of those poets were alive except for Brodsky. But I went to Poland in my early 20s and I discovered Czesław Miłosz. And through Miłosz, I discovered Zbigniew Herbert, and then I discovered Wisława Szymborska and Tadeusz Różewicz and the poets of Miłosz was a poet of the 30s, they were poets of the 40s. And I found what I was looking for. And then then I became a devoted internationalist and found other kinds of Eastern European poetry, like the Hungarian poets and others. And what I was looking for was a poetry of high intellection, that was really didn't sacrifice any intellect, but that was warmer, that was more passionate, more involved with history, had more feeling to it. And I don't know why I was looking for that, but I was. Something that wasn't sentimental, but that was passionate. And so I gravitated to this poetry. And then when I came back, I mean, my teachers didn't really know, no one really knew much about these poets, and they were just being translated for the first time. So I thought I'd just leap in and start writing about them. And that led me to other Eastern European poets. And then after that, because of that, I came to their attention. And so that's how I met Miłosz, and that's how I fell in love with Adam Zagiewski's poetry, and he's one of my closest friends now. And that's how I was poised when you were at Harcourt and published Wisława Szymborska. No one had really heard of her before. And I had known about her, though I'd never really read a full book of hers. And so I was ready. And so I got the New York Review of Books to let me review it. And there were no other reviews. And then she won the Nobel Prize. And then you and I could go around saying we got her the Nobel Prize.
You know, I never met Szymborska. I had an opportunity at the Frankfurt Book Fair after she won the Nobel. There was a long line of people waiting to get their books signed, and I was waiting to see her. And I was this close to coming up to her, and I was actually literally knocked to the ground by some very aggressive people who wanted her autograph. And then she was so taken aback by this ravenous horde that she rushed off. And I never, ever exchanged a book with her.
Too bad. She was very shy. After she won the Nobel Prize, the New York Times Magazine got the idea of sending me over there to interview her. And they wanted me to just go because it was the New York Times. But I didn't feel I could do that. So I called Zagiewski, and he told me to call Miłosz. So I called Miłosz and asked him if he thought it was a good idea and if he would, what he thought of it. And his wife, Carol, was on the phone. And there was just a long pause. And then Carol said, Czesław? And he goes, oh, Edward, I will introduce you. So he called Szymborska on the phone. And then he told me what he said to her. he goes, he's a good guy. You won't like meeting him, but you must sacrifice yourself on the altar of Polish poetry.
Oh, beautiful.
So she did. She sacrificed herself on the altar of Polish poetry, and I went to meet her, and I found her utterly charming, and just like her poems, lively, unpretentious,
Yes.
very funny, thoughtful.
Well, let me bring this down a few notches and talk about your own poetry. So you've written 10 collections of poetry. The newest one is just out last month, called Stranger by Night. It's been very interesting to read the arc of these poems. I mean, I think of you as one of the most joyous and joyful people I know, sort of radiating an interest and love for people. And yet I often think of your work in terms of grief. And it's not fair to call you a poet of grief, you're not. But there has been an interesting move over the decades. And this latest book particularly, it's very elegiac. I mean, it's elegant, but you're looking back, it's almost stately. And it struck me as very sad. These poems are beautiful, but there's a sadness. You're looking back at your childhood in a poem, for instance, called What is Happiness? You remember being happy as a child, but it's looking from the vantage point of an older man who's been through a lot. And I'm interested in this trajectory of yours, Eddie. And yet somehow you do maintain that joyousness, and your poems do reflect a happiness in the midst of this grief. It's an interesting combination.
As you know me pretty well, Andres. You know I'm kind of a high-spirited person by temperament, but things happen to you, and the losses keep growing. And poetry is a place where you can think about that, and you can think about grief in a way that's hard to do socially. And this book is a serious look back, I guess, at as the past grows on you. I mean, one of the things that you don't quite expect and you don't see coming is that so many of your friends die, especially if you were looking for fathers the way I was. I mean, the way I think of the poetry community is that I got a chance to replace my original biological family with a chosen family. You don't get to choose your family, but you do get to choose your companions and your friends. And I found a community and friends in poetry, especially some of the poets that I was talking about, not just Philip Levine, but Galway Kinnell and W.S. Merwin and William Meredith, and poets who really took a shine to me, and who I became a real friend with. And then I was 30 and they were in their 50s. Then they were in their 80s and I was in my 60s. And then they started dying. Mm. And I'd already spent a lifetime in poetry with them in some ways. So it just feels like you have to be true to your experience and to mourn those people. And that's where it starts. And then it's as you know, I write about every one of my jobs in the jobs that I had. And you just look back at what made you yourself and how the life you've had. I'm sort of resigned to the fact that you might have wanted to have a different life, but you only had one life, and it's your job to write about it. It's your job, if you think things matter to you, to somehow transform them. And so that's how I see this. That's how I see this book, Stranger by Night, as a look back into the past. And it's I mean, there's a sense of mortality all hovering over it, but there's also a sense to me of capturing moments. And there's a poem called The Radiance. There's a poem that you're talking about called What is Happiness, about capturing moments in time that are gone, they're lost, but you still remember them and you want to keep them alive in some kind of way, and you want to find a way to do that. And poetry seems to be a way to kind of capture that lyric moment out of time, to capture something that you want us to survive.
In a few minutes, I'll ask you if you'd be willing to read one of those poems. But so on the one hand, you have a gradual trajectory of stateliness and increasingly looking back at your life and missed opportunities or opportunities that went down one road or another. On the other, you have a very public profile as probably our country's most visible advocate for poetry. You're always giving readings, you're talking to classes, you're asked to spread the word about poetry. And you did a book actually called How to Read a Poem and Fall in Love with Poetry. And that title is such a great title, actually. But that book has sold a zillion copies, and it's a joyful evocation of why we should read poetry. Another interesting contrast about you, Eddie, the darkening poems, and then this radiant light of, yes, you have to go out and read poems. You must fall in love with them.
When I was in my 30s, I was really trying to make a life for myself in poetry. And then I found I could have one. And I was writing scholarly articles about poetry, and I was teaching poetry, and I was writing reviews and things. And then in my 40s, I began to feel that we shouldn't just take for granted that poetry will never have an audience, it will never have a readership. There was a lot of doom about that and the death of poetry. And I felt that I didn't like what had happened in literary theory and deconstruction, which I think is such a suspicious form of reading, even though it's so intelligent. And I decided to try and do something about it. And that's why I decided to write How to Read a Poem. It's funny you're making that joke about titles, since you know, everyone else may not know, that you were the editor of that book and that you were determined for that to be the title, even though I kept having different ideas. So you're giving me a little shot there that you and I get. But I realized that when I wrote that book, and then I started being asked to speak about poetry, not just to give my own readings, I felt happier. I felt like I was using what I knew. And I felt that would be part of my work and part of my vocation. And I've never let go of that side of it, of bringing people to poetry and bringing poetry to people, because I feel that's an American project. I don't just believe poetry is some elite thing and you either get it or you don't. I think we can bring it to people. I mean, there are limits. I'm aware of what those are. But I had a suspicion, as you did, as the editor of that book, and person who, more than that, commissioned it and got me to write it. I mean, we felt that there's got to be a larger audience for poetry, of people who somehow know there's something in it for them, but don't know how to find it, because they've been so turned off by the way that poetry's been taught, and that we could provide an alternative. And you wouldn't lose any intelligence about the way you talked about poetry. You wouldn't lose any seriousness about your thinking about poetry, but that you would bring people into poetry from where they are. I felt happy doing that, and I've always felt happy doing that. And it's been, I've had a really fulfilling life doing this work. At the same time, I feel that the nature of this work is that I am a poet talking about poetry. I'm not just a person who loves poetry. And that the work of writing about poetry and explaining poetry and advocating on behalf of poetry comes because I'm in touch with something. And that is, I can't let something die in me, which is the work itself, which is the art itself, which was my commitment to going down deep into the interior. And so this isn't the less social part of me. This is not the advocate part. It's not the high-spirited part. It's the part that really tries to figure out what my life has meant and think through the experience, and in particular, my griefs. I don't dote on them, but I'm aware of them and I want to honor them. And so I've had this sort of, you're pointing out, a kind of parallel track of trying to write my own poems and be true to what that would be, and what that sounds like to me and my own experience. And then this other work, which is related to my life as a reader and as an advocate for poetry.
That's very inspiring, Eddie. Thanks. Before we get to your reading a poem, I just want to ask, you came into poetry without any real backing from your family. This was alien to what your family had known. Can you just tell us a little bit about how your family responded to your being a poet?
Yeah, they thought I was insane. At first, they just didn't take it seriously. They just thought, oh, this is what he's doing. And then when I was a freshman, I decided I wanted to be a poet. And then when I was a sophomore, it hadn't changed. And then I really, this is what I was going to do. And my family became increasingly alarmed. And then they started the full arsenal of trying to stop me and block it, which it's not that they were wrong. It's very impractical to become a poet. And it just seemed like to them that I was wasting my intelligence and the education that they had worked so hard to give me. I was the first, I came from an immigrant family. I was the first person in my family to go to college. I thought they just couldn't believe that I would do something so wasteful instead of doing something really useful, like become a lawyer. They couldn't believe that I was doing so wasteful as writing poetry. And that was pretty much their attitude all through my 20s. I remember my mother once said to me, I was doing my PhD then, and she said, "Your father just blames himself." And I said, "For what?" She goes, "He blames himself that he couldn't convince you to go to law school." But then when I got a teaching job at Wayne State University in Detroit, and then I published a book of poems, my family started to relax a little. And then when I published a second book of poems and started getting, some prize and things, they started acting as if it were their idea.
Great. And your mother would come to your readings, didn't she?
Oh yeah, this was just one thing after the next with my mother. My mother would, at first, of course, I wouldn't let her come, and then I started to feel more confident, and I let my parents come. And I remember I was giving a reading in downtown Chicago it was the MLA, and it was with John Hollander and Michael Harper. It was a very high event. I thought I'll throw my mother one. She was in the back. I'll throw my mother. I'll read a poem about a science project that I made in her honor when I was in 8th grade. So I read the poem. In the back of the room, my mother shouted out, "That's not how I remember it." I go, "What?" She goes, "Your father made that science project for you." I go, "Oh God, this is just getting worse. It's just getting worse. It's just getting worse and worse." So my mother, she started coming to a lot of things, and she was very entertaining. Of course, I was always humiliated, but my friends thought it was hilarious. When I published How to Read a Poem, our book, I went to a bookstore in Northbrook where my parents were living, and I started giving a talk about how to read a poem, what was in the book. And then the whole time, my mother's in the front, and she's going, "This is so distracting." "Okay, Mom, what is it?" She goes, "Oh, honey, you're giving too much away. No one will buy the book." Anyway, it was always like that with my family. I found it very funny and embarrassing, and my friends loved it so much. And my friends would always say, "Yeah, we agree with your aesthetic, Mrs. Hirsch." Various things. So my mother loved my friend Garrett Hongo. And I especially know that she loved him because when I came home to visit one time, my book had been turned down and his book was up in the guest room.
Favorite son.
He was a better son. He was a better son.
Well, I wonder if you'd read a poem from your new collection.
Sure, be my pleasure. I thought I'd read a poem that's related to what we're talking about capturing moments. This is when I first started teaching in Detroit. It's called The Radiance. It's set in 1984. There's a figure in here, a friend of mine named Dan Hughes, who was a marvelous person, and he was a Shelley scholar and a poet, and he had MS, and so he was on his walker then. So there's a moment outside of State Hall in Detroit. The Radiance, Detroit, 1984. Late September in the shade outside of State Hall, that concrete brutality, where my students are smoking off a hangover and gossiping in Ukrainian, while Dan Hughes leans on his walker and talks to me about Shelley's bright destructions. I did not know it was indelible. The sun spangling the campus trees, the traffic thickening the smog outside the museum on Woodward, our voices rising. When you tell the story of those years going up in flames, don't forget the radiance of that day in autumn, burning out of time.
Mm. Lovely. Thank you, Eddie.
Thanks, Andre. Thanks for asking.
Thank you. I think we could probably take some questions now if there are any. Wendy?
I think I want to defer. What are you telling them? Are you telling them go to community college, or are you suggesting something else?
So I think the most important thing, and this is to make it broad for all students, is again to come up with those questions that they need to.
So I think maybe if we use the hand raising function for questions, because we have so many people here, I think perhaps it might work best if I'll just unmute people as they have questions. So people can use the hand raising function at the bottom or type a question in the chat box, and then I'll unmute your mic. Questions, anyone? Comments? Richard Holt is asking if you ever met Mary Oliver and if you have any recollections of her. Oh, hold on.
Reluctant, I'd say.
Eddie, we missed the first part of your response.
So I didn't know Mary Oliver. She was pretty. She was, by the time I would have known her, she was pretty protected by her partner. And I think if you hung out in Martha's Vineyard, you could see her. And some of my friends knew her, but she was not part of my circle.
Oh, if there's no other questions, if you don't mind if I ask a quick one.
Please do.
I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about Gabriel.
As a book or as a person?
As a person, I think I'm interested in hearing. Or either, however you want to answer the question.
So Wendy's asking me about my son, Gabriel, who was very troubled, incredibly funny, damaged person, and who died when he was 22 years old. And so I think Wendy probably knows about him because I wrote a book for Gabriel called Gabriel, a Poem, which really tells you as much as I can tell you about him. I had to change the way I wrote poetry to try and accommodate Gabriel and figure out what he was like and write about him in a way that seemed meaningful and accurate. And I was excited to do so. And one of the, I'd say, subjects of that book is that there really has not been another person like Gabriel in poetry. There are a lot of kids like Gabriel, but you don't see them in poetry. And it seemed to me that you ought to change poetry so that it could accommodate kids like Gabriel, not just try to change kids like Gabriel so they become more like poetry. So I tried to do that, telling the story from my point of view as a father. And Gabriel, the book, is a father's book. It doesn't tell Gabriel's story from his point of view. I can't do that. It doesn't tell it from his mother's point of view either. I can't do that. But it does tell his story pretty fully. I'm his biographer in a way in the book, and I write about. I tell his story, and from a father's perspective. It's a mournful book, but it has a lot of funny moments because Gabriel was funny, and those are the moments that make me happiest in the book. And I feel through the book, a lot of people know Gabriel who wouldn't know him otherwise. It seemed I couldn't bear that he was going to be forgotten. He just made such a little mark in the world, but he made such a strong mark on me. And so I felt just that I just had to write that poem so people would know about him. And now I think some people do, and that's been meaningful to me.
Thank you. Thank you. Walter S. has his hand up. Walter, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Ed Hirsch, I'm Walter Stewart. We had a wonderful friend, Dennis Turner, in common, and I don't think I've seen you for 40 years.
Wow, that's so cool.
It is very cool. I am, I am the son your mother should have had. I became a lawyer and always wanted to be a poet. So I've read you throughout my adult life, and like so many other people, I'm sure you have a lot of people, and poets are privileged to have this. I think people who walk through this life with them, who are from many, many different backgrounds and are not in English departments or Guggenheim fellows, but just whose lives are enriched by what you do. And I want to thank you so much for that, and let you know that all these years I have been I've been a voyeur of your poetry. And I wanted to ask you this, Ed. I was hoping when we got into the Mary Oliver question that you would go into some sort of rhapsody about Mary Oliver, which didn't happen. But so tell us, if you would, who do you recommend reading today, especially for people who can afford us the kind of accessibility that I think of your poetry provides? Because a lot of it, I must say, is dispiriting for people like me, a reformed English major, who, we try to get back into it, and it's baffling to us. It's self-referential. It's so academic that it becomes, it's Eliot on steroids. It's just difficult. And some of it, like yours, speaks to us so directly. Are there any younger Ed Hirsches out there that you would recommend?
Clarity isn't a great value for a lot of younger poets. I have the idea of Ezra Pound that all poets are contemporaneous. And when I wrote this column for the Washington Post that became a book called Poet's Choice, I recommend a poet every week. And a lot of my favorite choices are there. The Poetry Society of America has a program now called Reading in the Dark, and every week they post another poet writing about a poem that's meant a lot to them. It's not necessarily a contemporary poem, but it's like the poem that's meant the most to them during this time of isolation. And I think a lot of those suggestions have been good. I suggested a Turkish poet named Nazım Hikmet, who wrote a poem that I think is really wonderful called On Living. He's not a contemporary poet, but it's a great poem, and it speaks to our contemporary moment in a really powerful way. And I think if you looked at that, you might find not only just the poets. If you like the poem that the poet recommends, then it seems to me very possible that you'll like the poet who recommended it. If you don't like the poet the poem recommends, then I just sort of move on to someone else. But Walter, I want to just take a moment to say that I'm glad you brought up Dennis Turner, and he was a very close friend of Mark Diamond and mine. Mark knew him from Indiana. I knew him from Wayne, and I wrote my poem Fast Break for him. And he was a marvelous person, and the loss, he died in our 30s, was just tremendous. And it really taught me something brutal about life, because Dennis was the most charmed of all my friends. He had the most likable personality. If you were with Dennis, you felt like you were at the party somehow, was wherever he was. And so losing Dennis taught me that luckiness in personality doesn't mean luckiness in life. So I like to think about him, and I'm glad you brought him up.
Thank you.
Thanks. Wendy?
If there's no more questions.
Someone flashed me and said they had a question, but it's not on the screen.
Yes, okay, Ann Tucker here has a question. I'm gonna
Hi,
unmute.
Ann.
Hi,
It's nice to see you.
thank you. It's lovely always. I just wrote you an email saying I wish I could take your class.
Thanks, Ann.
Has meeting someone ever changed your feelings about their poetry?
Yes, that's an interesting question. I'm sure that Ann's a marvelous curator of photography in Houston, and so I'm sure she has an ulterior motive, which is she met a lot of photographers. She met all the photographers, and I'm sure it changed her view of those photographers. It's two different things to meet the poet, and sometimes when you meet a poet, it always is interesting. It's never quite what you expected. The poet is not exactly the same as the person's work. There's always a slight gap that is a bit disconcerting. In some people, the gap is very small. I'd say Philip Levine was like that. W.S. Merwin was like that. They were like their work. It wasn't a huge leap to think that that person had written that work. But there were other poets who you felt the person who wrote the work is just not available to me. Not that you dislike, sometimes you actually don't like the person, which is a bit of a shock. And you have a kind of chemical reaction against them. And then you go, it's better not to meet people. Sometimes it's better to just know their work. And sometimes you just feel that their work is private in a way that you just don't have access to. That's how I felt about, say, someone like Anthony Hack, who I think is a marvelous poet. But he was so formal when you met him, you just couldn't get past the formality. And I just realized, well, that you just can't do that. It reminded me of something, when I met him, it reminded me of something that Virginia Woolf said about T.S. Eliot. He looked as if he were wearing a 4-piece suit. And sometimes you meet someone and you feel as if they're wearing a 4-piece suit. So you're just not going to have access to that person, often because of some kind of vulnerabilities that the person has that is just very protective. I would think that my impression of everyone who I know who knew Mary Oliver, for example, is Mary Oliver was like that. You just weren't going to get access to the person that wrote those poems. Sometimes people need to protect something. And sometimes they do it in ways that are unpleasant. Sometimes their personality is formed in some kind of way to shape it. This is formed so early by people in terms of their personality and in terms of what's meaningful to them that you're not going to break it down. I was once complaining about someone I knew who I'd known him for 25 years, but it never got any deeper. And it was always the same superficial pattern. Someone who was extremely witty and clever, but you just felt like you never get any deeper. And I said this to one of my friends. He goes, well, he's not going to change his personality because he's met you. He's not capable of doing that. So I just felt, well, actually the person that wrote those poems is just not available to me. So sometimes, like, I loved Adam Zagajewski's poems, and I met Adam Zagajewski, and it was like immediate brotherhood because I recognized the person that wrote those poems right away, and there was no gap for us. And every once in a while that happens, but it doesn't always happen. It's just two different things. You like the work of some people, and sometimes you meet them and that's the person you met and you feel really lucky to become friends with them. Other times you like their work and you go, well, this is just not, it's just not feasible. So I try to keep them separate, and not be too over my life, not be too unsettled by it, and not start to dislike someone's work just because I don't like them. But I can't say I always live up to that. Occasionally I fail on this one too.
Thank you.
Good question. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And just personally, I long since learned early, I guess I learned that I wasn't going to get to like everyone, but
Yeah.
I had to like the work.
That's right. That's the most important thing. It's a real bonus if you like the person too, feel the person is menschy. That's really lucky, and that's how you get to be friends. But that's something different than just the work itself. Sometimes the work itself stands, and that's really, really good enough. You get the best of that person in the work.
I am really sorry. I have to leave now.
Okay,
Thank
bye,
you
Ann.
both very much.
Bye, Ann.
Looks like there's a question from Ben.
Thank you. I had two questions. One is, there's a story, maybe apocryphal, about Robert Frost being asked how he came up with the image of two roads diverging in a yellow wood, and what a way to capture life's choices. And he said, well, actually, I was walking down the road and there were these two roads that diverged. So would you comment on that? And then the second question, thinking about your mother's wishes for you, would Wallace Stevens have been different, written different poetry if he didn't work for an insurance company?
Those are two very interesting questions. First of all, I completely agree with you. I mean, Frost could be very canny. He liked to pretend that he was a country farmer, and he wasn't one. But it was a sort of act that he had. But I think it's very likely that he did see two roads and just said, oh, and then he made an allegory out of it. I don't think he started with the allegory. That would be a very unlikely way to write a poem, I would think. I would think that he was probably telling the truth there, that two roads diverged and he realized that if you took one, it would be different than if you took the other. But then he clearly starts thinking about what the consequences of that would be. So there's that on Robert Frost. I agree with you. Wallace Stevens is an amazing case, and of someone who just decided that he couldn't earn a living in poetry, and that he needed to find his way, and he went to law school and became an insurance person. He had no interest in social. When he was young, he was interested in New York poets a little bit and hung out at galleries where he met Stieglitz and met Marianne Moore and met William Carlos Williams. Mostly he wasn't interested in meeting poets. But there is in his work the most serious engagement with poetry. And one of the things that's really striking to me is when you read Wallace Stevens, you know that Wallace Stevens loved poetry. He loved the way that poetry had been written in the past. He loved the romantic poets. His poems are a kind of conversation with Wordsworth and with Keats and with Shelley. Sometimes he diverges from them, sometimes he argues with them, but he really did believe in poetry, and he needed to work for his personality and temperament. He was extremely isolated as a person. If you read his letters, his early letters are very defensive about poetry. You can see that he thinks that poetry is somewhat ladylike. He's embarrassed by his own feelings. He feels humiliated by them, and he needed to keep them private. But I think my own reading of this with Stevens is that he never got over his parents. His mother was a very pious Lutheran, and Wallace Stevens sort of just didn't believe in God. He just couldn't do it. But he was aware of the power of Christianity, and he wanted to believe, he just couldn't. And he's kind of affectless about it. But he knew what had been lost. He had a feeling about what is lost. I mean, that's, if you read Sunday Morning, which I think is his first great poem, you could see that's like, what am I going to do on Easter Sunday morning? I don't believe in anything. But what he believes in is, if that poem is a conversation with Keats's To Autumn and Ode on a Grecian Urn and a lot of other Wordsworthian poems. And you could see that he's putting himself to school on other poetry. And he believes that after the death of God, in his point of view, poetry takes its place as life's redemption. And that's what I've always found most moving in his iron solitude. There's a very good book by Peter Brazeau, which is an oral history of Wallace Stevens. And it's he goes and interviews all the people that knew Wallace Stevens at Hartford Life Insurance Company and people that he knew. And it's really funny. It's very interesting. It's not as if people didn't know Wallace Stevens was a poet, but they didn't have any idea what to think about his poetry. They were like, what is this? This is so strange and unbelievable and hard to understand. They knew he wrote poetry, but they just didn't have didn't have a clue as to what it was about. They decided to let him be. But he lived in this iron solitude. He had a very loveless marriage, and he lived on his side of the house, and his wife Elsie lived on her side of the house. And he wrote those poems, and those poems are a marvelous contribution. I mean, that's another example of Ann's point. Would you really want to meet Wallace Stevens? I don't think so. Richard Eberhard did meet him, and because Wallace Stevens took an interest in Richard Eberhard because Richard Eberhard's wife's father had started Butcher Wax, and Richard Eberhard became the president of Butcher Wax. And Wallace Stevens took an interest in him because he was in business. And so Richard Eberhard went to meet Wallace Stevens and walked around Hartford Life with him. And he said it was like being a tugboat pulled by the Queen Mary, which I thought was funny. Richard Eberhard wasn't the brightest bulb, but he did get to meet Wallace Stevens.
Well,
A few comments in the chat box. Wonderfully generous presentation. Thank you. I took 5 pages of notes from Richard. John Gillespie. Amazing insights about the nature of poetry. Very informative. So a lot of gratitude in the chat box to you and from all of us. Edward, thank you for sharing with us your insights and your poetry. Andre, thank you for your wonderful interview questions. This was such a lovely presentation. We're very, very grateful. And if no one has any final questions, we do have one person who wants to join right this moment. Allow them in. And
Thanks, Wendy. It's really fun to talk to you, and it's gratifying to talk to people about poetry in this strange moment of isolation.
Eddie, come up to Stockbridge, please.
I'd love that. I'd love that. Thanks.
We'll get you to the library.
Yeah, I'd really like that.
we look forward to that. Thank you again
Thanks.
so much.
Be nice when we can be together.
Yes. Indeed.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you for coming. Appreciate your time.
Thank
Keep
you.
the spirit. Bye.
Stay well. Bye.